Yeah.
Are you all ready? Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Student Research Showcase. My name is Mohammed Khalil. I'm Director of the Muslim Studies Program. We're delighted to have you all with us for this hybrid event. Basically, I should say that we have 5 presenters, and the mere fact that they were selected is an indication that their papers were exceptional. We had a committee reviewing each of the papers. They consisted of our faculty advisory committee, professors Linda Sayed, Kaveh Askari, and Nazita Lajavardi. And we also had MSU librarian Deborah Margolis reviewing all the papers. Oh, and are we recording this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I want to thank them for taking the time to go through all the papers and selecting the ones to be presented this evening. At the conclusion of the event, we will announce the honorable mention awards, just the fact that they were selected, and then we'll have one award winner for each category of undergraduate and graduate paper. So we're going to get right to it. Our first presenter is Abbie Barnum. And Abbie is a junior studying social relations and policy, comparative cultures and politics, and Arabic. Abbie is passionate about issues relating to representation and development of the global South and is looking forward to discussing her research with you all. The title of her paper is "The Role of New York Newspapers in Perpetuating Islamophobic Stereotypes." So please join me in welcoming Abbie Barnum. And each presenter will have 10 minutes. So let's go ahead and pull up your presentation. Actually, let me share screen. And here we go. Okay, I think that should be good. Oh, no, it is.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abbie Barnum. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and today I'm going to be discussing a little bit about my research and my work, which focuses on the role of New York newspapers in perpetuating Islamophobic stereotypes. So first, I'd like to mention the guiding question that honed all of the methods that I'm going to discuss in my work, which is how did New York newspapers perpetuate Islamophobic stereotypes throughout the 1990s specifically? I first would like to dive into a little bit of historical context. It's really important to consider a few key events, among many others, that really guided not only public sentiment, but also the coverage that the public wanted to see in newspapers at the time, so throughout the 1990s specifically. The first event that I'd like to touch on is the Gulf War. So coverage of the Gulf War throughout the 1990s mainly focused on how Arab powers such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt were really calling on the United States and other Western powers for some form of intervention, whether it be humanitarian aid, financial allyship, etc. And another event that was heavily covered in the media in New York newspapers throughout the 1990s was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. One specific event within this was the $10 billion loan that the United States stated that they would not be giving to Israel, that they had previously guaranteed to Israel, but they were stating that they would deny those funds unless Israel froze all construction in the West Bank and Gaza Strip areas. And then the third event is the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So this was an event that occurred on February 26th in 1993, and a bomb exploded in the basement parking garage of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. This was a massive explosion, huge tragedy that killed 6 and injured over 1,000 people. So guided by those key events, and as I mentioned, various other ones, New York newspaper coverage employed 3 different methods to perpetuate Islamophobic stereotypes. The first that I discuss in my work is misleading titles. So here we can see just 3 of many titles that employed harmful language, such as the first one by Elaine Siliono that equates Islam to the Red Menace. So here we can draw parallels between communism, which was viewed throughout the Red Scare as a threat to democracy and just a domestic terrorist threat in general. And here Elaine Zulino is trying to plant in readers' minds a parallel between communism and Islam. And then also we have Chris Hedges, who is a relatively popular journalist. He's published several works, especially in the New York Times, and most of his work utilizes words like fervor or fervent, or for example, we can see guerrillas are planting fervent Islam in Bosnia. Here he uses these inflammatory words to spark a distinct image in the reader's mind of Islam as a weapon that is being employed by extremist groups or guerrilla groups, and is further perpetuating stereotypes of Islam as extremist and, again, threats to democracy. All right. So I'm going to dive into the next method, which I discuss in my work, and it sort of ties into the misleading titles in the sense that the rhetoric is not only present throughout the articles, but also in those titles. So in the rhetoric section, I really delve into a few different types of rhetoric, the first being us versus them, where Western media, such as New York newspapers, puts a literary divide between the West, which is New York in this case, and the rest, which would be predominantly Islam countries or countries that practice Islam, and also Muslim Americans, specifically if they're talking about domestic issues. And as I mentioned before, inflammatory word choice, so words that spark a distinct image in the reader's mind, like fervent, fervor, radical, extremist, things like that, as well as harmful language. And this specific point was really guided by a study that was done by Derek Silva in 2014, where he defined, based on some survey methods, language that reinforced stereotypes of Islam specifically as being radical. And so any language that did that and perpetuated and reinforced those stereotypes, he deemed as harmful. And as I mentioned in my previous slide, Chris Hedges' article, this one specifically, employing the words fervor and fervent in connection with Islam is one example in the title, but then also within the article, Chris Hedges explicitly characterizes Islam as radical, which is directly and explicitly perpetuating those stereotypes by explicitly saying that. And then Chris Hedges also quotes professionals in the foreign diplomacy field, such as NATO officials, who repeatedly equate Islam to a ticking time bomb, which again perpetuates stereotypes that have existed historically, but are just now being reinforced and perpetuated through his piece as unstable and extreme. And the next method, which I focus on, is images and graphics, which a lot of people pinpoint as less problematic in the sense that it's difficult to draw the line between what is performative and what is not, specifically pertaining to cartoons and like caricatures of groups. This specifically though, this image on the left portrays Muslims as would-be terrorists, which is in the words of Sean Delonis, who was the artist who sketched this up. And this specifically really ties into, at the time, domestic pushes for counterterrorism initiatives and counterterrorism legislation, which ended up informing the Patriot Act later on in the early 21st century, which wanted to garner and improve surveillance of communities that they identified as threats to democracy and domestic terrorism threats, which, as we, I think, have, or many of us have seen, has directly targeted, in the case of the Patriot Act, predominantly Muslim communities. And then this image as well is in an article by Michael Field. And here at the top, not only do we employ the inflammatory rhetoric, by characterizing Islam as militant, but it also shows a genie, which is coming out of a bottle, which is meant to represent Islam, as going head to head with Uncle Sam. And here this further perpetuates stereotypes of Islam as being the foil to American values or America in general. And the significance of the perpetuation of these stereotypes is huge. So firstly, they had a huge impact on and still have a massive impact on policy, not only domestic as we have seen in the case of the Patriot Act, but also internationally. Throughout the 90s, as we saw with the case of the denial of a loan and then various other policies that have transcended through the 21st century, these stereotypes have dictated funds and humanitarian aid given to predominantly Muslim communities or Islam practicing countries, such as refugee populations, those who have been displaced, people seeking asylum, and many different issues like that. And then also it's resulted in the normalization of Islamophobia in modern day social media outlets like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as political representation and education systems where we can see harmful rhetoric being used in curriculum that covers historical events like 9/11 and the Gulf War, as well as political debates and legislation, further utilizing and employing harmful or inflammatory rhetoric, and so on. And it's really important to understand the perpetuation of stereotypes via earlier news outlets, such as newspapers, because we can track this perpetuation in order to better understand the impacts of perpetuation via modern media. And it's also really important to understand how this has negatively impacted communities through generations. So generationally, negatively impacting Muslim communities so that they are not only facing increased discrimination through policies, but also mentally, emotionally, and physically being discriminated against. And these are just a few sources that I covered in my presentation, but there are many more that if you're interested in checking out are mentioned in my paper. And I believe that's all, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Abbie. We have maybe a minute if somebody wants to ask a clarifying question before we move on to the next paper. Let me just check to see online also if there are any questions. Already there are questions. Okay, let's see. Oh, excellent work, Abbie. That's from Professor Rebecca Karam. Yes. People in Zoom cannot see the slides. The computer is frozen. Oh, well, hopefully that was resolved. That was at 7:04. I assume that was resolved. I hope that was resolved. If not, please let us know. But thank you so much, Abbie. Any questions before we move on? All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, Abbie.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, next we have Areeba Nadeem. Areeba Nadeem is a pre-law student planning to graduate this semester. She is majoring in social relations and public policy, as well as philosophy. And the title of Areeba's paper is The State's Role in U.S. Muslim Racialization. And now I will turn it over to Areeba, and let me share the screen here. Let's see. Here we go. And I think, let's see, we do view slideshow. I think that's how we do it. All right, okay, there we go. Oh, we still have the old one, oh my. Okay, let's see here. Let's figure this out.
You have to stop sharing and reshare.
Okay. Well, first let me get X out of this. Okay, and I'll even X out of, I'll just minimize it. Share screen. Let's see, Nadeem. Yes. Slideshow. Yes, and yes, okay.
Thank you. So my name is Areeba. I go by she, her, hers, and my topic is the racialization of Muslims in the US and the state's role in doing so. So first, I'll go into why I chose this topic, then I'll touch on the theory, its implications, then I'll run over very briefly a few case studies. So the reason I chose this topic is because Islamophobia, as it is, often relegates the entire issue down to individual bias or ignorance, when in actuality, the plight of US Muslims originates in the historical unfolding of institutional behavior affirmed and perpetuated by the state, which is what I explore in reorienting a theoretical framework and analyzing this in the first place. So, and also my own personal experiences lend into why this research is meaningful for me. I'm Pakistani, and sometimes when I'd wear the hijab, some people would come up to me to practice Arabic because they think that I was Arab, when in actuality I'm not at all. Or I remember in high school, my classmate who is Christian Iranian, he would get bullied and called a terrorist, even though he was never even Muslim to begin with. So that Muslim-Arab conflation always confused me, and this study helped me to unpack that. And also to demonstrate the falsity of the Muslim-Arab conflation, you can see how the top 5 most populated Muslim countries are neither in the Middle East and nor are Arab majority. And the 5th one, which I did not list, is Nigeria. I figured.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to talk about racialization theory. So with racial formation theory, Omi and Wynett define it as the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified social practice or group. So they define this relationship on power and privilege, because to race a group is to articulate a hierarchy which changes over time. So in order to have a better understanding of racial meanings, we had to expand our conception of it from not just phenotypic traits, but to include cultural and ethnic traits as well. Because phenotypic and cultural traits, they work together to generate racial meaning. And the reason why we don't want to focus on phenotype alone is because that lends itself to scientific and biological racism, which is, we want to avoid that. And also by looking at racialization as a combination of factors, we get to include ascriptive aspects such as immigration, gender, and language when it comes to race. So the goal of this presentation, the goal of my research was to track the state's role in reifying and affirming a Muslim racial category throughout history. In my research, I look at 5 case studies: early American history, enslaved African Muslims, naturalization era, Cold War to pre-11 era, and then post 9/11 era, and then post 9/11. But for the function of today, I'm only going to briefly cover 2, and that's it. But so to talk about the implications of Muslim racialization, it's first important to recognize the Orientalist influences in painting an Arab man as inherently unassimilable, inherently foreign, inherently subhuman. So then the conflation of Arabs and terrorism then influences the gaze of Muslims themselves, because Islam becomes a defining feature of the Middle East due to Orientalism. So then the perceived Muslim then gains a racialized image of a terrorist on them, irrespective of their actual religious practices or beliefs. So the linking of phenotype to an othered culture, to an othered Arab culture, then creates what it means to be Muslim looking. That term was always bizarre to me from the beginning. So that helped me understand that a lot. And then with all these Muslim looking people, they get essentialized into these boxes with labels such as asylum seekers or terrorists. To racialize a Muslim group is to determine that they have natural qualities of being inherently unassimilable, inherently foreign, inherently sexist, et cetera, et cetera. Also, what happens is that religious symbols such as the hijab, they then denote natural characteristics of the person wearing the hijab. So then they become naturally submissive, naturally naive, naturally oppressed, et cetera. This also lends into other complications such as with Sikh American men. So having brown skin, dark colored hair, a beard, some kind of head covering, they then experience Islamophobia because of this racialized image of a Muslim. Lastly, by legitimating state boundaries based on biological and cultural cues, this leads to a rejection from social and formal citizenship, because to be perceived as inherently foreign then becomes a racial act. And also religious symbols acquire racial meanings in a way that designate who belongs inside and outside the national community. So to touch very briefly on the first case study, I focus on the naturalization era. So during this period, and according to the 1790 Immigration Act, people had to prove their European ancestry in order to demonstrate their whiteness, in order to gain citizenship. So Syrian and Armenian petitioners who could not prove their European ancestry, they initiated a series of court battles to prove their whiteness through other means. They relied on a white racial feature of that time, like Christianity, which whiteness as is an evolving category itself. So that was specific to that period. So what's interesting was that if all Muslims are Arab and all Muslims must be non-white, Arabs were ineligible for citizenship. This did not mean that the court discussions were centered on acute religious discussions about if someone is actually a practicing Muslim or actually a practicing Christian. They relied on terminology based on racial purity and ancestry in order to determine that. Therefore, they were projecting a racialization of religion. Also, it's through these court discussions that weds the Muslim identity and the Arab identity into the conflation we see today. And we see that in those legal terms. So first of all, 1909, George Shisham, he was previously denied citizenship, but then Judge Hudson, who initially gathered him being non-white because of him being Arab, he ended up being convinced like, okay, this guy is like a true authentic Christian, therefore he is white. And then he was racially reclassified by the law. And yeah, he was designated legally non-Arab because of that. And he was granted citizenship. And the reason this decision was founded was because of this idea that Shisham's family ancestry was able to develop a resistance against Muslim blood in the area. The terminology used was Arabian or Ottoman blood, but it's a proxy for Muslim. And then also in 1942, Syrian Christian petitioner George Dow was denied citizenship because he was fluent in Arabic. So because he was fluent in Arabic, he could not possibly be Christian according to the courts. However, that was reversed by Judge Woods, who claimed that all Syrian people have a little bit of like Syrian blood, and therefore there should be a need to rescue those immigrants from further contamination from Muslims in that area. So as you can see with at least a couple of the court cases, race as a social construct is constantly negotiated, but the state has an upper hand in articulating those categories. And then lastly, very briefly, racial and religious cues indicating an inherently inestimable trait to American culture becomes really important in the modern era when we see the regulation of citizenship it takes a further step in this. So moving beyond the courts, various government sectors engaged in numerous national security measures that disproportionately affected Muslim and Muslim-looking communities. And for example, in 1999, the Supreme Court ruled that 8 Palestinians who were targeted for deportation could not object due to their affiliation in a terrorist organization, even though they were not being convicted of terrorism in the first place. So the suspension of their civil and human rights were not based on any actual terrorist activity, but on their religious and ethnic affiliations that denoted natural qualities about them of being politically disloyal. So this image of a foreign Islamic terrorist is imprinted in the institutional memory of the United States. This Muslim-Arab conflation and the racialized Muslim is redeployed from previous periods into the post-9/11 era. And the manifestation of this Muslim terrorist enters the national consciousness, not because of someone's actual religious practices or beliefs, but because of the way they look, the way they culturally express themselves, and their nation of origin. So what happens then with the rise of the surveillance state, Arabs are not only targeted, and they are, but also a plethora of brown bodies across ethnic lines get subjected to scrutiny because of this like racialized image. So therefore, the state receives new powers to categorize a Muslim racial category, and creating their national community. And we see this manifest today with the Muslim ban and etc. So for my conclusion, cultural identifiers such as religious and ethnic cues have long since informed racial categories. The historical evidence from this presentation, but also with the other case studies, not only present the various transformations US Muslims underwent via state constructions, but how American interiority is contested and framed. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Areeba, and very interesting presentation. Maybe a minute for clarifying questions. Any clarifying questions? And let me look at the Q&A here. Okay, I'll clear these. Any clarifying questions from anyone? No? Okay, very good. Well, that was great. I mean, so those were our two undergrad presenters, and I don't know, Abbie and Areeba, what your future plans are, but I see future professors. So keep up the great work. All right. Well, now I will we'll now go to the graduate portion, and we have three presenters. The first presenter is Mehmet Eroğlu, and Mehmet is a first-year PhD student in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences at Michigan State University. He joined MSU in the fall of 2021 as a Fulbright scholar. Prior to MSU, he received his BS in Geomatics Engineering and his MS in Science, Technology, and Society at Istanbul Technical University. Currently, he examines how the decline in the coal industry affects historical coal mining cities and regions spatially, economically, and socially. And the title of Mehmet's paper is Making of a Mining City, the Historical Geography of Zonguldak. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, perfect.
Between the 1840s and 1970s. So please join me in welcoming Mehmet.
Thank you. Just a second, sorry for that.
Thank you.
I think it is working right now.
Yes,
Okay,
I was, yes.
Okay, perfect. And let me, okay. Sorry for taking my time. Hello everyone, my name is Mehmet Eroğlu. I'm a first year PhD student. I go by Hedges in the Geography department. And today I'm going to talk about my paper. The title is Making of a Mining State, the Historical Geography of Zonguldak between the 1840s and 1970s. I want to start with some acknowledgements. I want to thank Museum Studies Program for organizing this event. I want to thank my department of Geography. I want to thank Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Also, I'm a Fulbright student, so my studies are supported by Fulbright. I want to thank them. And also, I want to thank Mr. Doğu. He's from Zonguldak. Okay, I should say this first. Zonguldak is a city in Turkey. So he's from Zonguldak, and he has a great, very rich personal photo archive, and I'm using his archive. He's very kind, so he shared lots of pictures with me. I'm going to use some of them in this presentation, so I want to thank him personally here. Okay, today's talk, I want to start with the introduction. Again, I want to introduce Zonguldak to you first. Then we will have three sections for the historical geography of Zonguldak. The first section is the late Ottoman period, 1840s and 1910s. And the second one is 1920s, 1950s, between 1920s and 1950s, early Republican period. And the third one is between 1950s and 1970s, Zonguldak as a company town. And finally, I will conclude. Okay, the introduction, I want to start with the map as a geographer. So you can see Zonguldak here on this map. It's on the western Black Sea coast of Turkey. It's the name of the province and the city. And Zonguldak, again, is the historical coal extraction center of Turkey. Before 1840s, which is the late Ottoman period, Zonguldak was only a small village with a very low population. And with the discovery of coal, Zonguldak changed in a few decades and it became a mining town first during the Ottoman period. And with the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, it gained even more importance and it became a huge industrial center. But by the 1970s and 1980s, like Zonguldak became like a very huge place for Turkey. The coal production, the number of workers and the population reached a peak. But then starting from the late 1980s, with the effects of neoliberalism, state investments began to decline in Zonguldak and Zonguldak became a shrinking city. So for this presentation and for this paper, I'm not going to focus on post-1980 period, but I am trying to argue here, Zonguldak now is a shrinking city because it has historically been totally dependent upon a single extractive energy resource, which is coal. So I am trying to tell the story of how Zonguldak became a dependent and vulnerable mining city. And when the mining industry started to decline, it meant the decline of the city as well. Okay, our first period is the late Ottoman period. Since our time is very limited, I want to just mention a few main things about each period. And for the late Ottoman period, I want to mention Dilaver Pasha. So when coal was first discovered during the late Ottoman period, Ottoman government was super happy because they thought, okay, it's going to be our energy resource, especially for the developing navy. But in the beginning, coal production was not very good because people didn't want to work in the mines because they didn't have any idea about the practice of coal mining. So Ottoman government sent Dilaver Pasha to Zonguldak, and Dilaver Pasha introduced Dilaver Pasha regulations. According to these regulations, every male villager between the age of 13 and 15 living around Zonguldak had to work in Zonguldak mines. So the main thing is compulsory labor for this period. But they were working also as a rotational miners. So they were working in the mines for 2 weeks and they were staying in the villages for 2 weeks. So these regulations changed everything about Zonguldak. It changed it spatially because now we have all these mines, but also it changed the identity of people because, yeah, like can you imagine you are one day are told like, okay, now you are a miner and you have to work there. But these regulations also cover so many different things like weights, working hours, working age, and even prayer times for Christian and Muslim miners. Like if you are like, if you can, I couldn't find any English version, but if you can read Turkish or Ottoman, I very strongly like recommend read. It's 100 article and it's very fun to read because it's about everything. So during that time, lots of foreign and local private companies made huge investments in Zonguldak, and they changed Zonguldak spatially. So again, this is the first stage of Zonguldak becoming a mining city. So they made investments. So they opened factories in Zonguldak. They opened coal preparation plants in Zonguldak, and those pictures are from late 19th and early 20th century. They established a port in Zonguldak. Again, Zonguldak was a very small village, and now it is a port. And the reason is just the transportation of coal. And you can see Zonguldak streets again, early 20th century, and the main streets are with railways. And again, the reason is the transportation of the coal. So that was the first stage of how Zonguldak became a mining city. Our second stage is early Republican period. Republic of Turkey was established in 1923. You can see here Mustafa Kemal, he was the first president of Turkey. And on the left, you can see İsmet İnönü. He was the first prime minister, then he became the second president. Those are, considered the founding fathers of Republic of Turkey. And they were also very much interested in Zonguldak because they thought, okay, these mines are going to be our main energy resource for the modernization and industrialization project. But they had a very liberal agenda in 1920s. So they abolished all Dilaver Pasha regulations or other forced labor things. But when we came to 1930s, everything changed because 1930s were the period of general economic crisis in the world. So they adopted a more statist economic model. And in 1930s, they started to nationalize Zonguldak coal fields. And by 1940, they bought all private companies. So Zonguldak Basin was completely nationalized, which means the state was the owner of all mines and employer of everyone working in Zonguldak mines. And state stayed like that until late 1980s. But another important thing about this period is the Nation Protection Law, which was implemented in 1940 during the World War II period. Turkey didn't join the war officially until the very end, but they want to take some precautions and they want to increase coal production. So they established the second period of forced labor, which lasted 7 years. So they were in the beginning very much against these forced labor laws, but at the end they were like, okay, we are going to do the same thing, and they did for another 7 years. So this is the second stage of how Zonguldak became mining city. And finally, our third stage is between 1950s and 1970s. Okay, this period is a more liberal period. There was no forced labor or something like that, but state took a different strategy and they were making like huge investments in Zonguldak. And I'm not talking about only mining investments, but also very social investments. Like they opened schools or like movie theaters for miners. And they also opened several factories around Zonguldak, again, state-supported factories. So Zonguldak and its surroundings became an industrial center, but also particularly Zonguldak, the city of Zonguldak and the province of Zonguldak became a state-supported company town. So during that period, again, the coal production, number of miners and population increased significantly. I'm going to show this very briefly and then I will conclude. So you can see like a broad perspective of Zonguldak. On the left and top, you can see coal production workers between 1942 and 2012. So as you can see, between 1940 and 1980, there's a fluctuation, but starting from 1980s, we see like a very steady decrease, again, because during that period, the coal mining industry started to decline and state reduced investments. On the right, you can see population of Zonguldak. From 1950 to late 1980s, there's like an increase, and then there's a huge decrease, and today it's still decreasing. And finally, coal production in Zonguldak, between 1940 and 1908, let's say, there's an increase. The red line is total production by state company, and blue one saleable production by state company, and the green one is production by private companies. As I said, it was a state project between 1940s and 1980s. So private companies started to make production in late 1980s, but it never became a huge thing. It was always negligible. So you can see on the left the making of a city, and on the right you can see unmaking of a city. Because again, my main point is, as a conclusion, Zonguldak was turned into a vulnerable and dependent mining city with direct state interventions such as labor regulations, forced labor laws, and nationalization. So the decline of the mining industry means decline of the city in Zonguldak. And as a final thing, Zonguldak project is my main project for my dissertation, so I'm still working on this. And this summer, I will conduct a field work there, so I can draw from some oral histories, and I will have an access to some archives, and hopefully we will learn more about Zonguldak. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. Let me just see if we have any clarifying questions. I actually have a question, but let me see if there are any questions on the chat. I wonder if you could tell us, thank you, Mehmet, that was very interesting. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what led you to be interested in Zonguldak.
Well, yeah, everyone asks because people think I am from Zonguldak. I'm not from Zonguldak. I never been to Zonguldak, interestingly. I was born in the south part of Turkey. Well, I was reading, the main thing is in Zonguldak, there are so many health problems, urban health problems. And during COVID, like there were so many precautions, and it was covered like main cities in Turkey, but only exception was Zonguldak, because there's a huge health problem, just like all coal mining regions. So it was interesting to me in the beginning. Then I started reading, and one thing led to another. Oh, this is interesting. Like when I first heard about the labor regulations, it was really interesting. I never seen such thing before. So I just kept reading and reading. Yeah. And that's the final thing.
Right, that's really interesting. Well, thank you so much, Mehmet. I appreciate it. Thank you. All right, very good. Yes, round of applause. Thank you. All right, our next presenter is Nadir Fouani. Nadir is a second-year master's student in the Student Affairs Administration program, graduating this May. Nadir received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Wayne State University. Nadir is currently job searching to work in higher education, attempting to assist minority students in their overall development and college experience. The title of Nadir's presentation, or Nadir's paper, is Arab Involvement in Higher Education. So please join me in welcoming Nadir Fouani. Thank you. All right, stop the share here. And let's see, we want, not this one. So let's see here. I thought it was, it might not be pulled up. Okay, so maybe I'll turn it over to you if there's an easy way to, let's see, is it up here? No, it's not there. If that's possible. Sure. I'm not sure what happened there. I thought we had pulled it up. Sorry. That's okay.
It's on the flash drive.
Oh, it's on the
Oh, it is,
flash
okay.
drive. Oh, okay. Yes.
This is the folder.
Yes, that would be it. And I think maybe if we click on this one. Oh, maybe actually, yeah, maybe
Go ahead, you can.
Oh, no, so sorry. Is it here? Showcase, yep. And then we want, there it is, perfect. So now we'll do share screen. All right, share screen. Okay, so
Perfect,
now I
thank you
think
so
we're
much.
good. Thank you.
How's everyone doing today? My name is Nadir Fouani. I also go by Nadir Fouani. My pronouns are he and his. I'm a second year graduate student from the Student Affairs Administration program. My topic today is Arab involvement in higher education, and really more specifically in Michigan, as I narrowed down my paper and research. So to start, to kind of talk about some of my methods for my paper, really the why of why I kind of attacked this topic was to really focus on the role of Arab students, faculty, and staff. And I really find that they're an under-researched group, and the groupings of what an Arab is often really misconstrued at universities. As we heard from earlier presenters, some Arabs may identify as white, some may not, some might identify as brown. Then we have a lot of confusion with the term Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab. So I really found that really interesting in my archival research as well. And then for me, I'm the son of immigrants from Lebanon, so this topic is near and dear to my heart. And I'm from Dearborn, Michigan, which is the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the nation, or really outside of the Middle East. And then the method that I use today really is about just from archival databases in higher education institutions. I did have a lot of trouble finding a lot of sources, but that is why I narrowed down my search just to Michigan, as I found a lot of things in the Tri-County area. And then lastly, the purpose is that I argue that figuring out how to kind of best serve these populations is really an important necessary step for many universities, as I feel our identities are not given a lot of praise or even just kind of inclusion, in dining halls, residence halls. Even myself have faced a lot of discrimination or harassment this week, and I'm an assistant community director, so really interesting to kind of explore that. And then moving on, so in this presentation, kind of looking at the roadmap, I'll give a brief overview of Arab immigration, specifically again in Michigan. Arab higher education Michigan universities, I'll be talking about 4, and then access, support, discrimination, and involvement will be kind of spread throughout the entire presentation. And then lastly, I will discuss how Arabs are kind of thriving in higher education today. So, yeah. All right, so again, just to kind of give some historical context of Arabs in Michigan, defining a little bit about what Arabs are. So Arabs are an ethnic group, classified as members of Semitic people, and they are from 22 different countries, as you can see on the bottom here. And they come from many parts of the Middle East and really North Africa. And throughout this presentation, I just want to clarify, I'm going to be referring to Arabs as just Arabs. Obviously, again, there's different terms, but this includes non-Muslim Arabs and then Muslim Arabs as well. And I know someone mentioned earlier, there's many countries that are considered Muslim, and we often portray them as Middle Eastern, but we have most of the majority Muslim countries are actually not in the Middle East at all. So some of the first Arabs to arrive in Michigan is around 1870s to 1890s. We have a lot of Syrian and Lebanese Christians kind of immigrating here, moving to Detroit, Michigan, looking for work, kind of escaping whatever's going on in that area, and really working for Henry Ford was a big major producer. And then soon after, we have our first Muslim Arabs in Michigan from 1920 to 1925. We have Palestinians, Yemenis, a lot of other Muslim Arabs kind of establishing a presence in Michigan. All right, so the fall of the Ottoman Empire also, and the Levant area is divided into Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. So again, looking at a brief overview of Arab immigration, we're kind of seeing a lot of historical events that occur. Obviously, these are very complicated and political topics. I'm not going to dive too much into them, but these are some of the few things that have occurred that's related to the Arab influx in Michigan. We also have the Lebanese Civil War that occurred and the Iraq War of 2003. And then we have Arab perception in the United States really changing a lot during 9/11. 9/11 attacks were a huge shift in our way we were portrayed, we were discriminated against, things like that. And then I do have a little bit of description of kind of the influx, and they call us again a small exotic community. As you can see, the language is really important here. Maronite Christians moving from Lebanon, and we have Henry Ford mentioning Syrian men kind of coming around. And then we have, again, Chaldeans, Yemenis, Palestinians, and many other populations. So kind of talking a little bit about the discrimination against Arab Muslims and how it affected our livelihood. The safety and comfortability of many Arabs' lives, again, were really pushed, and this affected a lot of higher education, students in higher education. Like I mentioned earlier, residence halls, dining halls, things like that. There wasn't many support from higher administration from some of my research that I'll talk about later. And it's really interesting how this, terrorist, quote unquote terrorist label is often misconstrued upon us. And then we have this Islamophobic reaction kind of occurring again and multiple times throughout the 2010s as well. So just to kind of start the four universities that I'm going to be talking about, I have Wayne State University that I'll be starting off with, which is my alma mater, Michigan State University, Henry Ford College, and then University of Michigan, Dearborn, which I will talk about. So starting off with Wayne State University, looking through their archival data, it was actually really difficult to find anything from the early 1900s and mid 1950s, things like that. I did find a fraternity which claimed themselves as the Arabian fraternity. And obviously, they actually were not Arab. So it was really interesting to learn from this, right? So the fraternity often they had this newsletter that would come out, and you can see the crescent moons, and they're trying to kind of portray this Oriental identity, which is very interesting. And they have this Arab hymn and the Wayne hymn that they kind of recited. And I found this very odd, but not that surprising, because I mean, in 1920s, 1930s, you likely did not see these groups coming, and especially going to college, right? And surprisingly enough, the university president, President Kirby at the time, he proclaimed them to be the Arab fraternity. They were actually known as the Friars early on. He's the one who told them to change their name. They eventually changed their fraternity name to Phi Gamma Chi, which is not currently registered at Wayne State University. And then I did notice a lot of just symbolization throughout this newsletter, and I kind of looked through a few, but these are just a couple of examples. So again, moving forward, I did find some more recent things. I mean, not recent right now, but just 1960 to 1969. I do see in the top right here, Arab Student Association. That stuck out to me sort of. And I saw that they were directed by an actual, Arab, actually having some good representation in the faculty level for once. So I did some, research on who this person was. And I kind of dug down that, and he was actually born in Lebanon, and he studied at the University of Cairo in Egypt. He was actually the US ambassador for the country of Bahrain, or Bahrain, if you haven't heard that. And I really tried to reach out to him or try to find something so I can interview him. I could not find anything for the last 15 years. It feels like he just disappeared into thin air. But nonetheless, it was nice seeing a active member who was also identifying as an Arab to lead this Arab Student Association. And again, these are the religious and ethnic clubs. There's not very many in the 1960s, as you can see. So moving on to Michigan State University, I really saw a lot of interesting things here too. This is a photo of the Arab Club at the International Festival of MSU in 1966, obviously portraying some of the clothing that we may wear. But yeah, there were a lot of multiple meetings that I noticed from the university. So between the offices of the Board of Trustees and then the president, and how they were going to kind of resolve issues, especially with the 9/11 attacks. So I did this through a website called the On the Banks of the Red Cedar, so referring to our Red Cedar River. And then the first meeting I noticed was involving Arabs in 1999. That was the first time I would keyword search, and I was digging through all these archives. It took me a very long time, but 1999 I found one. I was so happy, and I would search, keyword search Muslim, Arab, and this is what I found. So there was actually a faculty member, Dr. Janine Ciano, who was kind of speaking on behalf of Muslim students, faculty, and kind of giving praise to our community and actively pursuing cross-cultural communication with other minority groups or religious minority groups. So it was very nice to see that. And again, this is one example of support that we actually got. They also talked about holding a vigil post 9/11 for Muslim students, for Arab students. And I really like to see the support for once, early on. Moving on to the second and third meetings, they were involved, again, following the 9/11 attacks. The trustees and the president were trying to talk about how we can kind of shift from this 9/11 Islamophobic label to just them as normal students, regular everyday students. Really interesting to see how they would reach out. There was not a lot of student interaction, I'd say. It was more so like a faculty member trying to support a student. In the fourth meeting, I did see some progress within diversity in general. So it was nice to see the Arab community wasn't stated and involved in this project. And then in the fifth meeting, they were actually recognizing some Muslim populations that were impacted by a bombing that occurred in London. This is about 2005. And again, more support from this. The last meeting that I found was in 2006. Obviously, the last 10 years I found a lot, but really in the 2000s, it was improving relations with the country of Kuwait. So I was seeing an American University of Kuwait wanting to develop some relationship with study abroad programming, things like that. So moving on to Henry Ford College. So Henry Ford College is in Dearborn, Michigan. And I did find this in the catalog in 2005, 2006. And it was nice to see a class about Middle Eastern cultures. It was really cool. So you can read that little description, but they talk about the role of Islam and shaping the history and the culture of the region, as well as how Arabs and in the United States are examined. And it was really nice to see cultural perceptions being actually portrayed here. Another one is, excuse me. There was another thing about offering 5 languages. So the 5 languages they offered, Arabic was included in that. So that was also really nice to see. And then this anthropology course, I was trying to find who was running the course, the professor of that. I could not find any data about that. So I was really interested to see who actually taught that. And then kind of talking about some themes of access, support, discrimination, involvement. We see examples from 3 universities showing these key themes. However, we do also see some of the things from Pew Research data, of anti-Muslim assaults exceeding their total in 2001. And then on the left-hand side is actually a Florida pastor named Terry Jones who had come to Dearborn to burn a Quran in front of the community at the Islamic Center of America. So we have a lot of these, Islamophobic themes that we see. And again, like I mentioned before, a huge shift happening to Arabs and Muslims post 9/11. So what does Arab higher education look like today? I use the University of Michigan Dearborn really because they have the Arab American Studies program, which they offer a minor and they offer a certificate, which I found really to be amazing. I know I would have been interested in that if I had the opportunity at Wayne State University. They also do have a Center for Arab American Studies. So, kind of looking at it today, we do have some support, we do have some acknowledgement, not just at a very basic, let me bring you to the table talk, but where you can get a certificate, you can get a minor, you can study some of the populations and cultures and languages. What's really great about this is we have a lot of MENA, Middle Eastern, North African identifying faculty and staff. And I find that really valuable. Some of my greatest mentors are Arab and they understand who I am. So having that support is really important in higher education. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadir. First, let me see if there are any clarifying questions. Let me check online as well. Nope. I will say this was a very interesting presentation because I've lived some of this history. And I will say that you may find interesting. We have a website that we developed called muslimsofthemidwest.org. And one of the people we interviewed was a man named Omar Subani, who basically founded the Islamic Center, one of the main founders of the Islamic Center here. And he talks about his experience on campus and in the 70s. You might find that interesting. I'll also mention that as far as the Arab student organizations go, I know for sure they existed before '99. And here's how I know. I met my future wife at a meeting in '96. And I was, yeah.
Should I ask you your archive and stuff?
Yes. I'm happy to provide information as well. And I'll also say regarding the effects of 9/11 on this campus, the reason we exist, the Muslim Studies program, if we're going to be honest, historically, it's 9/11 and the aftermath. I mean, 2004, after 9/11, that's when the conversations begin. It's after 9/11. So, I hate to say it, but that's why we exist.
In Arab American literature too.
Arab American literature, yeah.
There was big
That's right.
Lots of writings.
That's right.
About that.
Yes.
More engagement. So
Post 9/11.
yeah, it's almost like
Yeah.
an abundance of production after
Yes.
9/11,
Yes.
especially by women authors.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
I will say regarding U of M Dearborn, I think the reason why Arab American Studies is so big is because they probably have the leading scholar, Sally Howell. who has that book on building Islam in Detroit, or building Islam in Detroit, I think is the title. One of the leading scholars in that area. Well, thank you so much, Nadir. That was great. Last but certainly not least, we have Hanan Aly. Hanan Aly is a PhD candidate in the Department of English. She works on Anglophone and Francophone diasporic literature, and she'll be defending her dissertation soon. So we wish her the best on that. And the title of soon to be, inshallah, Dr. Hanan Aly's paper is Listening as a Healing Ethic in Assia Djebar's Femmes, dans leur appartement. Was my French
Yeah.
okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so please join me in welcoming soon to be Dr. Hanan Aly.
Oh, thank you so much. It's okay. I don't have anything interesting going on.
No, it's fine.
Really, just talk about books.
Yes.
That's all I'm gonna do. Hi, everyone. So this is part actually, it's a small portion of my first chapter. I'll be studying on the 2nd of May, fingers crossed. So today I focus only on a motif that I noticed is common in Assia Djebar, one of Assia Djebar's novels. And this is the women of Algiers in their apartment. I just read the paper and try to be as fast as I can, just 10 minutes, and then hopefully open questions later. Assia Djebar's novel, The Women of Algiers, depicts a group of Algerian women whose personal histories interweave with the history of Algeria, especially during the period of the French colonial rule. And this is from 1830 to 1962. Victims, survivors, witnesses, and participants in international history during the Algerian War of Independence, women lived through the far-reaching ramifications of colonial and gendered dispossession. Drawing on Butler and Estenazzi's understanding of dispossession as a misuse of our precarity, I use gender dispossession to refer specifically to the misuse of the gendered subject's precarity, which is manifest in the deprivation of Algerian women's civil rights, then their subjection to corporeal and epistemic violence. In this chapter, I investigate how Djebar's novel represents multi-layered experiences of dispossession and capture the psychic, ethical, and philosophical nuances of dispossession. I argue that the novel features listening as a self-effacing act of tending to the other, that enables the dispossessed subject's recuperation from trauma. And this is like a pretty maybe complex concept, but I'm happy to flesh it out some more. So listening, I'm reading listening as restorative or recuperative of something called intimate selving. And intimate selving is actually specifically historically, it's a historically and culturally specific mode of relationality to the other. It's not a Western mode of relating to other. It's something in between. It's how the person can relate at an intimate level to one person, but also relates to a collective. And they share a history. It's a very different, it's a non-Western mode of relationality that I think her novel does bring to light, and that listening in her novels features as a healing ethic in that sense. Such a self is integral part of the collective, but is not subsumed by it. The intimate self is neither exclusively individual nor collective, but both. Much of the scholarship on Djebar has primarily focused on how the text restore women's voices and counter the colonial male gaze and the Arab patriarchal silencing. These are the most common readings of her work. My reading, however, I highlight listening actually as a common motif in her work, both in The Women of Algiers and in many of her other works. And in so doing, I am emphasizing what is yet underemphasized in the scholarship, while also bringing together the scholarship emphasis on gaze and speaking together. The Woman of Algiers depicts a group of Algerian women from different ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds in France and Algeria over the span of 20 years. Written in an experimental non-linear narrative style, the novel features multiple plot lines, each centering on the lives and struggles of a few Algerian women in different settings before and after Algerian independence. I'll focus only on one part of the novel, which is called The Woman of Algiers. The Women of Algiers. It is the most elaborate, colorful, and intricate part of the novel. At the center of that part is Sarah, who is a musicologist working on transcribing and translating women's songs, and who's married to a surgeon. She spent her adolescent years in a colonial prison. And Layla, who like her, was also imprisoned during the Algerian War. The two women characters, Sarah and Layla, militants or fire carriers, are examples of the nationalist women heroines who have been tortured and raped in the notorious Barbarossa. The corporeal and sexual torture serves as a colonial terror tactic, as Fanon and Mehmet would argue, to deter the Algerian pursuit of independence. The terror tactic is not only aimed at Algerian women who are expected to be intimidated with learning of what happens to militant women in prison. It is also, and maybe more so, aimed at Algerian men within the patriarchal proprietary calculus integral to the colonialist system and Algerian culture. The sexual violation of the Algerian woman is the ultimate humiliating and forbidding scare tactic. Joshua Cole reflects the impact of torture and rape in particular, and how they were particularly used by the French. It's not coincidental, it was a systemic terror tactic. And he said torture and rape are about to establish a particular relationship between French soldiers and Algerian Muslims, one in which the most essential parts of the victim's personality, the integrity of their bodies, their relations with their families, their connections to a religion, to a cause, were annihilated. Cole also pinpoints that what makes torture all the more traumatizing to the victims is its intimacy. Torture is an intimate violation of one's body by another. It possesses the same sweaty closeness and proximity as an act of love, the same casual familiarity with the most private recesses of the bodies, its fluids, smells. This is why torture and rape Sarah and Layla experience in the novel have a deeper psychic scar on both women that we see extending for years after Algerian independence. As victims of rape and torture, Layla and Sarah suffer to essential parts of their personalities, including the integrity of their bodies, relations to their family. And such damage basically damages what Saad Joseph calls intimate selving, the dynamic process by which the Arab subject forms a network of connections, the dynamic process of forming a self with an interconnected network of selves, woven through intimate relationships that are lifelong and that transform over the course of personal and social history. Sarah's process of recovery in the novel starts after listening to Layla speak during an encounter where Layla suffers what seems to be a mental breakdown. At one point, Sarah tries to calm Layla, telling her, "Be quiet, my darling, don't talk anymore. Words, what good words are." Yet Layla insists to give voice to her traumatic memories and painful experiences in prison. Listening to Layla speak of her torture and rape and pain actually initiates Sarah on her process of healing. Listening to trauma offers here a virtual space to rework her own traumatic experience. Because so Sarah has been the silent one. She's called the silent one in the novel. She's the one who has never been able to talk about, to relate what kinds of torture she actually experienced in prison long after, unlike Layla, who's always voicing these pains. After some time, we see Sarah herself, the silent one, turning to Anne, saying, I see no other way for us except through an encounter like this. A woman speaking in front of another, one who's watching. The one who's speaking tell the story of the other with a devouring eye, with the black memories. Or is she describing her own dark night with words like torches and with candles whose wax melts so fast? She who watches, is it by means of listening and remembering that she ends up seeing herself at last with her own eyes unveiled? Here, Sarah is identifying listening as the one way out for the two of them, a spatial configuration, which in light of the female character's predicament, they keep bumping into the walls of the past, unquote, bids us interpret the way out as liberation from confinement of the past trauma. Speaking of Black memories and listening to another woman's Black memories allows Sarah to vicariously re-encounter her own experiences that she has not been able to fully integrate into her life. It is interesting that it's only after that we see Sarah opening up and actually speaking about her own trauma. It is only after that she speaks of the most painful moment she experienced during her imprisonment, which is getting the news of her mother's death while she is in prison. Listening in the novel, I argue, figures in direct opposition to the male gaze. While the male gaze seems to objectify the other and subjects the other to its power, precluding a dialectic, listening to the other opens the subject up to the other. Openness to the other is best captured in this quote by another woman character. Little by little, other people fill you up in a barely noticeable way. For me, they begin by filling me through my eyes. All these past months in that house full of old aunts and cousins, I said to myself, all I have to do is to listen to the other. That's enough for me. And she goes on to listen to the other, simply listen to him, look at him, loving the other while observing him. Your own fever disappears, your own violence, the cries you've never let out. The voice of the other reaches you, the one who is suffering or who has suffered and who is unburdening himself. And there you are, weeping with him and for him. So here listening features as a cathartic almost experience that allows you to process experiences that you have not been able to fully claim in the past. The ethical relationality here is predicated on opening oneself to the other by just listening to him. The transformation is affected by the voice of the other rather than the face of the other, as Levinas would call. Assia Djebar, the woman of Algiers in their apartment, represents then colonial gendered experiences of dispossession, traumatic experiences, but also features listening as an embodied act that alongside speaking offers potential for healing from subjective and collective traumatic experiences of dispossession. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any clarifying questions? We'll check the Q&A here online. Nope. Nope. All right, no clarifying questions. Well, thank you so much. That was, one thing I noticed throughout all the papers is there are themes, all kinds of themes. One theme is the theme of pain and how to deal with that, how to grapple with that. So, if there are no clarifying questions, I think we can proceed then to the conclusion. First, I want to thank you all. I want to thank everyone here for showing up. I want to thank Mary Ferdowsi for dealing with the logistics. I want to thank Rael Silva for filming. Rael is filming a promotional video for Muslim studies. I mentioned this to the presenters beforehand. If you don't want to be in the video, please let us know. We'll be sure to remove you, but this is just a promotional video for MSU. And I want to thank those who attended also online as well. So, and most importantly, I want to thank the individuals who reviewed the papers, took the time to review the papers. Again, they are Professors Linda Sayed, Kaveh Askari, Zita Lajavardi, and Deborah Margolis of MSU Libraries. They reviewed all the papers and they selected the 5 to be here today. And so for those of you who are maybe new to the CV game, feel free to include this in your CVs that you were selected for inclusion in the showcase. And now it's time to announce the recipients. First of all, everybody, so those who do not get the Best Paper Award get the honorable mention just for being selected. So the honorable mention for the undergrad, we'll start with that. That is Areeba. So round of applause for Areeba. For a great paper. And honestly, I'll tell you this. There was a lot, it's close. There's some really close votes there, but the Best Paper Award goes to Abbie Barnum. So round of applause for Abbie Barnum. Yes. So 2 excellent papers there. And then we go to the grad papers. Again, all excellent papers. The honorable mentions go to Nadir and Mehmet. So round of applause for both. And the Best Paper Award goes to Hanan, soon to be Dr. Hanan Aly. So round of applause for her. So I want to thank you all again for joining. And by the way, if you didn't receive the award this year, I will say that we've had people apply the next year and get it the next year. So anyway, at this time, I'd like to ask those who are presenting to come up for pictures, and that concludes our event. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. And I will